In the final days of April 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin, Nazi officials frantically worked through the night. They weren't preparing defenses, they were burning documents, destroying evidence, and eliminating witnesses to some of the most disturbing secrets in human history. What were they so desperate to hide? What truths were so horrifying that even hardened Nazi commanders preferred to see them destroyed rather than discovered? Tonight, we're going to uncover the terrifying secrets that the Nazi regime tried to take to their graves. From underground facilities hidden in occupied territories to classified research programs that violated every principle of human decency, we're about to explore the darkest corners of Nazi Germany that they never wanted you to see. The first secret takes us to a place where medicine became murder, where healing became horror. In 1945, American forces discovered something at Dachau concentration camp that left even battle-hardened soldiers physically ill. Behind locked doors, they found detailed records of what the Nazis euphemistically called medical research. But these weren't medical experiments. They were systematic torture sessions designed to push the human body beyond its breaking point. Dr. Sigmund Rascher, a Luftwaffe physician, had been conducting what he called high-altitude experiments. Prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers that simulated altitudes of up to 68,000 feet. The goal was supposedly to help German pilots survive at extreme altitudes. The reality was far more sinister. Subjects were forced to endure conditions that would kill them slowly and painfully. Their screams echoed through the medical facility as their lungs collapsed and their blood began to boil. Rascher meticulously documented every detail: the time it took for consciousness to fade, the physical changes in the body, the exact moment of death. But the altitude experiments were just the beginning. Nazi doctors conducted freezing experiments where prisoners were immersed in ice water for hours. They wanted to study hypothermia, ostensibly to help German soldiers on the Eastern Front. Victims were left in water so cold that their body temperature dropped to levels incompatible with life. Some were then rewarmed using various methods, including being placed next to naked women, turning human warmth into another tool of degradation. The most chilling aspect wasn't the experiments themselves, but the clinical detachment with which they were conducted. Nazi doctors took detailed photographs, made careful measurements, and wrote comprehensive reports as if they were studying laboratory animals rather than human beings. Dr. Josef Mengele, known as the Angel of Death, took this medical barbarism to even more disturbing levels at Auschwitz. His obsession with twins led to experiments that defy comprehension. He would inject chemicals directly into children's eyes, attempting to change their color. He performed surgery without anesthesia, deliberately infected healthy individuals with diseases, and conducted genetic experiments that served no scientific purpose whatsoever. What made Mengele particularly terrifying was his demeanor. Survivors described him as charming and well-dressed, whistling classical music as he selected victims for his experiments. He would give children candy and call them his little guinea pigs, before subjecting them to unimaginable suffering. The Nazi medical program wasn't limited to concentration camps. In occupied territories, they established research facilities disguised as hospitals and clinics. These facilities conducted experiments on prisoners of war, civilians, and anyone else they could capture. One facility in Poland focused on studying pain tolerance. Prisoners were subjected to various forms of physical trauma, while doctors measured their responses. The goal was supposedly to develop better interrogation techniques, but the real purpose seemed to be sadistic curiosity about human suffering. The most disturbing discovery was a cache of films that Nazi doctors had made of their experiments. These weren't scientific documentation. They were essentially snuff films, created for the entertainment of high-ranking Nazi officials. The films showed victims in their final moments, their faces twisted in agony, while Nazi doctors calmly discussed their observations. When Allied forces began closing in, the Nazis made desperate attempts to destroy all evidence of their medical crimes. They burned documents, killed witnesses, and demolished facilities. But they couldn't erase everything, and what survived painted a picture of evil that went far beyond battlefield brutality. But the medical experiments were just one part of a much larger, more systematic program of horror that the Nazis were desperate to keep hidden from the world. While the world focused on military battles, the Nazis were waging a different kind of war. A war against childhood itself. The Lebensborn program, initiated by Heinrich Himmler in 1935, was one of Nazi Germany's most closely guarded secrets, and for good reason. On the surface, Lebensborn appeared to be a welfare organization for mothers and children. The reality was a systematic program of human breeding and child theft that would reshape the genetic landscape of Europe according to Nazi ideology. The program began with the establishment of maternity homes, where unmarried women could give birth in secret. But these weren't ordinary maternity facilities. They were breeding centers where carefully selected women, those deemed racially pure, were encouraged to have children with SS officers and other Nazi elites. Himmler personally oversaw the selection process. Women had to prove their Aryan heritage going back at least 4 generations. They underwent extensive physical examinations, measurements of facial features, and psychological evaluations. Those who passed were given a special status within Nazi society and provided with luxurious accommodations during their pregnancies. The children born in these facilities were considered the future elite of the Nazi state. They were given special education, superior nutrition, and were groomed from infancy to become the next generation of Nazi leadership. By 1945, approximately 20,000 children had been born through the Lebensborn program. But the breeding program was only half the story. The other half was even more sinister: the systematic kidnapping of children from occupied countries. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other conquered territories, Nazi officials implemented a program called Germanization. They would identify children who displayed what they considered Aryan characteristics, blonde hair, blue eyes, certain facial features, and simply take them from their families. These children, some as young as 2 years old, were sent to special facilities where their identities were erased. They were given new names, new birth certificates, and were told that their parents had died. They were forbidden to speak their native languages and were brutally punished for any sign of their original identity. The process was methodical and devastating. Nazi officials would arrive at schools, orphanages, or even private homes with lists of children they wanted. Families who resisted were told their children would be better off in German care, or they were simply overpowered by armed guards. In some cases, entire villages were targeted. Children would be lined up and examined like livestock. Those who met the racial criteria were loaded onto trucks and driven away, while their parents watched helplessly. Many of these families never saw their children again. The stolen children were distributed throughout Germany and given to Nazi families who couldn't have children of their own. These adoptive families were told that the children were orphans from German territories, victims of Allied bombing. They had no idea they were participating in a massive kidnapping operation. What made this program particularly cruel was the psychological manipulation involved. Children who remembered their real families were told they were having nightmares or false memories. They were given new histories, complete with fake photographs and fabricated stories about their German heritage. The Nazis established special schools where these kidnapped children were indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. They were taught to hate their countries of origin and to view Germans as their saviors. The psychological trauma was systematic and complete. By 1944, an estimated 200,000 children had been stolen from their families and processed through this system. The vast majority were never reunited with their birth parents. Many grew up never knowing their true identities, living their entire lives as unwitting victims of Nazi crimes. The documentation of this program was extensive, but the Nazis made desperate attempts to destroy the evidence as the war ended. They burned birth records, destroyed photographs, and eliminated witnesses. However, enough survived to reveal the scope of this systematic theft of childhood. What made this secret particularly terrifying was its long-term implications. The Nazis weren't just trying to win a war. They were attempting to fundamentally alter the population of Europe, stealing an entire generation and molding them into the foundation of their 1,000-year Reich. But even this massive program of human trafficking paled in comparison to what the Nazis were planning in the depths of occupied Europe, in facilities so secret that most Nazi officials didn't even know they existed. In 1935, Heinrich Himmler established an organization that would become one of Nazi Germany's most bizarre and terrifying secrets, the Ahnenerbe, or Ancestral Heritage Society. While the world believed the Nazis were focused on military conquest, this secretive organization was pursuing something far stranger and more disturbing. The Ahnenerbe was supposedly dedicated to researching ancient Germanic history and proving the superiority of the Aryan race through archaeological and anthropological studies. But behind this academic facade lay one of the most twisted research programs in human history. Under the leadership of scholars turned fanatics, the Ahnenerbe funded expeditions to Tibet, searching for the origins of the Aryan race. They sent teams to Iceland to study ancient Norse ruins. They excavated sites across Europe, looking for evidence of prehistoric German civilizations. But these weren't ordinary archaeological expeditions. In Tibet, Ahnenerbe researchers conducted detailed measurements of local populations, creating extensive catalogs of skull shapes, facial features, and body proportions. They were searching for what they believed were the remnants of an ancient Aryan colony high in the Himalayas. The expedition, led by zoologist Ernst Schaefer, brought back thousands of specimens and photographs, but also engaged in practices that violated every principle of scientific ethics. The real horror of the Ahnenerbe wasn't in its foreign expeditions, but in its domestic research facilities. Hidden away in castles and remote locations across Germany, Ahnenerbe researchers conducted experiments that blended pseudoscience with sadistic cruelty. At Wewelsburg Castle in Westphalia, Himmler established what he called the Center of the New World. This wasn't just a research facility. It was designed to be the spiritual center of the SS, complete with occult rituals and ceremonies that would have seemed absurd if they weren't so dangerous. The castle contained a circular room known as the General's Hall, where SS leaders gathered for mysterious ceremonies. Below this was an even more sinister space called the Realm of the Dead, where the remains of prominent SS officers were to be honored in perpetuity. But these ceremonial spaces were just the visible part of the castle's activities. In the basement levels, accessible only to those with the highest security clearances, Ahnenerbe researchers conducted experiments that defied rational explanation. They were attempting to unlock what they believed were ancient Aryan powers, telepathy, clairvoyance, and other supernatural abilities that would give the Nazi state an insurmountable advantage. Prisoners from nearby concentration camps were brought to Wewelsburg for these experiments. They were subjected to sensory deprivation, forced to endure extreme temperatures, and given various drugs while researchers monitored their responses. The goal was supposedly to identify individuals with psychic abilities who could be used for military purposes. But the Ahnenerbe's interest went far beyond the supernatural. They established anthropological research units that conducted gruesome studies on living human subjects. At the University of Strasbourg, Ahnenerbe researchers created a collection of human skulls and skeletons from murdered prisoners, all in the name of proving racial theories. Dr. August Hirt, an anatomy professor working with the Ahnenerbe, specifically requested that 150 prisoners be killed so he could study their skeletal remains. He wanted to create what he called a complete collection of Jewish skull shapes for his research. The prisoners were murdered using poison gas, and their bodies were processed like specimens in a laboratory. The Ahnenerbe also funded research into ancient Germanic religions and attempted to revive pre-Christian rituals. They believed that by reconnecting with these ancient practices, they could unlock spiritual powers that would ensure Nazi victory. SS officers were encouraged to participate in solstice celebrations, runic ceremonies, and other neo-pagan rituals. What made the Ahnenerbe particularly disturbing was the way it combined academic respectability with barbaric practices. Many of its researchers held legitimate university positions and published papers in scholarly journals. They maintained the appearance of scientific inquiry while conducting experiments that violated every principle of human dignity. The organization's influence extended throughout the Nazi hierarchy. Himmler regularly consulted with Ahnenerbe researchers on matters of policy and strategy. They advised on everything from military tactics to population management, always through the lens of their twisted racial theories. As the war progressed, the Ahnenerbe's activities became increasingly desperate and bizarre. They funded expeditions to search for the Holy Grail, believing it would grant supernatural powers to whoever possessed it. They researched ancient weather control techniques, convinced that Germanic ancestors had the ability to influence natural forces. In the final months of the war, as Allied forces closed in, the Ahnenerbe made frantic efforts to destroy evidence of their activities. They burned libraries full of research, destroyed artifacts, and eliminated witnesses. Many of their most disturbing experiments were so secret that records were kept in code, making it difficult for post-war investigators to understand the full scope of their activities. The few surviving documents paint a picture of an organization that had completely abandoned scientific rationality in favor of ideological fanaticism. They weren't just trying to prove Nazi theories. They were attempting to reshape reality itself according to their twisted worldview. But while the Ahnenerbe pursued their occult fantasies, other Nazi organizations were working on projects that were all too real and far more immediately dangerous to the world. One of Nazi Germany's most carefully hidden secrets was their collaboration with Japan's infamous Unit 731, a partnership that created some of the most horrifying biological weapons programs in human history. This alliance, kept secret even from many high-ranking Nazi officials, revealed the truly global scope of Axis atrocities. Unit 731, officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, was established by the Japanese military in occupied Manchuria. Under the leadership of microbiologist Shiro Ishii, this facility became a center for biological warfare research that matched and sometimes exceeded Nazi brutality. The Nazi-Japanese collaboration began in 1940, when German scientists made contact with their Japanese counterparts through diplomatic channels. Both nations were interested in developing biological weapons that could turn the tide of war, and they quickly realized they could benefit from sharing research and techniques. Nazi Germany provided Unit 731 with detailed information about their own biological research programs, including data from experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners. In return, Japan shared the results of their extensive human experimentation program, which involved thousands of Chinese, Korean, and Russian subjects. The scale of Unit 731's operations was staggering. The main facility in Pingfan covered over 6 square kilometers and employed more than 3,000 researchers, technicians, and support staff. But it was the nature of their work that made this collaboration so terrifying. Unit 731 researchers infected prisoners with plague, cholera, anthrax, and other deadly diseases, then observed the progression of illness without providing treatment. They performed live dissections on infected subjects to study how diseases affected internal organs. They tested the effectiveness of various biological agents by releasing them in occupied territories and monitoring the results. The Nazi contribution to this program was substantial. German scientists provided Unit 731 with detailed protocols for conducting human experiments, including techniques for maximizing suffering while keeping subjects alive long enough to provide useful data. They shared information about their own plague research and offered suggestions for improving the efficiency of biological weapons production. One of the most disturbing aspects of this collaboration was the exchange of actual biological agents. Nazi Germany provided Unit 731 with samples of diseases they had weaponized, while Japan sent samples of their own biological weapons to German research facilities. This created a truly international network of biological warfare development. The partnership extended beyond just sharing research. Nazi and Japanese scientists traveled between facilities, observing each other's work and providing technical assistance. German doctors visited Unit 731 facilities and participated in experiments, while Japanese researchers spent time at Nazi biological research centers in Europe. The goal of this collaboration was to develop biological weapons that could be deployed against Allied forces and civilian populations. Both nations were working on ways to deliver disease-causing agents through bombs, artillery shells, and even contaminated food supplies. The Nazis were particularly interested in Japan's research into plague-infected fleas, which could be deployed as biological weapons with devastating effect. Unit 731 had developed techniques for mass-producing infected fleas and had tested their effectiveness in field trials against Chinese populations. In return, the Nazis shared their research into aerosolized biological agents that could be dispersed through the air to infect large numbers of people simultaneously. They had developed sophisticated delivery systems that could spread diseases over wide areas with minimal risk to the attackers. The collaboration also involved sharing information about human experimentation techniques. Nazi doctors provided Unit 731 with detailed protocols for conducting experiments that would yield the maximum amount of scientific data while inflicting the maximum amount of suffering on subjects. Unit 731 researchers developed what they called special tests, experiments designed to study human responses to extreme conditions. Subjects were exposed to temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius to study frostbite, then had affected limbs amputated without anesthesia to observe the healing process. They conducted pressure experiments where subjects were placed in chambers and exposed to crushing atmospheric pressure until their eyes popped out and their organs ruptured. They tested the effects of electricity, radiation, and various toxins on living human beings. The Nazi-Japanese biological warfare program also included research into agricultural weapons designed to destroy enemy food supplies. They developed diseases that could kill crops and livestock, potentially causing mass starvation in enemy territories. As the war turned against the Axis powers, both Nazi Germany and Japan made desperate attempts to destroy evidence of their biological warfare collaboration. They burned research documents, demolished facilities, and eliminated witnesses who could testify about their activities. In the final days of the war, Unit 731 researchers killed all remaining test subjects, estimated to be over 3,000 people, and destroyed their research facility. They scattered across China and Japan, taking their secrets with them. Many escaped prosecution entirely, with some even being recruited by American intelligence services in exchange for their research data. The Nazi biological warfare program was similarly dismantled, with researchers fleeing to South America or being captured by Allied forces. Much of their research was confiscated by the Allies, but significant portions were destroyed before they could be recovered. But even as they worked on these apocalyptic biological weapons, the Nazis were simultaneously pursuing an even more ambitious and terrifying project that would have fundamentally altered the nature of human civilization itself. While the world knows about the Holocaust and the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, what remains largely hidden are the Nazis' plans beyond the final solution. These weren't just crimes of war. They were blueprints for the complete restructuring of human civilization, according to Nazi ideology. The final solution, as documented in the Wannsee Conference of January 1942, was presented as a plan to eliminate European Jewry. But surviving documents reveal that this was merely the first phase of a much larger program that would have reshaped the entire population of Europe and beyond. Classified documents discovered after the war revealed something called the General Plan East, a comprehensive blueprint for the colonization and Germanization of Eastern Europe that went far beyond anything previously understood. This plan called for the systematic elimination or enslavement of entire populations across Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and the Baltic states. The scope of this plan was breathtaking in its cruelty. According to Nazi calculations, approximately 31 million Slavs would need to be eliminated to make room for German settlers. An additional 14 million would be kept as slave laborers, while the remainder would be forcibly relocated to Siberia or other remote areas where they would likely die from starvation and exposure. But the Nazis weren't content with simply eliminating populations. They wanted to erase entire cultures from existence. They developed detailed plans for destroying national monuments, burning libraries, and eliminating any trace of non-German history in the occupied territories. Schools would be closed, languages banned, and cultural practices criminalized. The implementation of this plan had already begun by 1942. In occupied Poland, the Nazis initiated what they called Action AB, a program designed to eliminate the Polish intellectual class. University professors, teachers, clergy, and cultural leaders were systematically hunted down and murdered. The goal was to leave the surviving population without leaders who could organize resistance or maintain cultural identity. Similar programs were implemented across occupied Europe. In Czechoslovakia, the Nazis destroyed entire villages and murdered their inhabitants as part of what they called pacification operations. The village of Lidice was completely erased, every building demolished, every resident killed or deported, and the very name of the village removed from all maps and records. What made these operations particularly sinister was their systematic nature. The Nazis created detailed census records of occupied populations, categorizing individuals based on their perceived racial value. Those deemed suitable for Germanization would be separated from their families and sent to special facilities for cultural re-education. The rest would be marked for elimination. The Nazi plans extended beyond Europe. Documents recovered from SS headquarters revealed ambitious schemes for the colonization of Africa, South America, and other regions where German settlers could establish racial colonies. These plans included the systematic elimination of indigenous populations and the establishment of German-only territories. In Africa, the Nazis planned to establish vast plantations worked by enslaved local populations. They had identified specific regions in Kenya, Tanzania, and Southwest Africa where German colonists would create agricultural settlements. The existing populations would be forced into labor camps or simply eliminated if they proved troublesome. The South American plans were even more detailed. Nazi agents had been operating in Argentina, Brazil, and other countries since the 1930s, establishing networks that could support large-scale German immigration after the war. These weren't just escape routes for war criminals. They were the foundation for entire German colonies that would serve as bases for spreading Nazi ideology throughout the Western Hemisphere. What made these plans particularly terrifying was their integration with Nazi racial theory. The colonization programs weren't just about territorial expansion. They were designed to create racially pure German societies that would serve as models for the rest of the world. The Nazis had developed detailed criteria for selecting colonists, including extensive genealogical research, physical examinations, and psychological evaluations. Only those who met the strictest racial standards would be allowed to participate in the colonization programs. These colonial settlements would serve as laboratories for Nazi social engineering. Children would be raised according to strict Nazi principles, educated in special schools that emphasized racial superiority and military training. Marriage between colonists would be carefully regulated to ensure the maintenance of racial purity. The Nazis also planned to use these colonies as bases for spreading their ideology to neighboring countries. They envisioned a gradual expansion of German influence that would eventually encompass entire continents. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the Nazis' plans for what they called the final phase, the complete elimination of Christianity and its replacement with a new Germanic religion based on ancient pagan traditions. This wasn't just anti-Semitism. It was a plan to destroy all existing religious and cultural traditions that conflicted with Nazi ideology. SS research units had been developing what they called the New Germanic Faith, complete with revised scriptures, new holidays, and ritual practices designed to reinforce Nazi racial theories. They planned to gradually replace Christian churches with new temples dedicated to Germanic gods and Nazi heroes. The scale of cultural destruction envisioned in these plans was unprecedented. The Nazis weren't content with military conquest. They wanted to fundamentally alter human civilization itself, creating a world where only their twisted ideology would survive. As Allied forces closed in on Nazi Germany, officials made desperate attempts to implement accelerated versions of these plans. They established model communities where their social engineering theories could be tested on a smaller scale. They intensified their efforts to eliminate cultural and religious leaders who might preserve non-Nazi traditions. But even as these grandiose plans were being developed, Nazi scientists were working on weapons that could have made their global ambitions achievable. Weapons so powerful they could have changed the course of human history. In the final years of World War II, while Allied forces pressed toward Berlin, Nazi Germany was desperately racing to complete weapons programs that could have altered the outcome of the entire war. These weren't just military developments. They were technological leaps that could have given the Nazis the power to dominate the world for generations. The Nazi nuclear program, led by physicist Werner Heisenberg, was far more advanced than most people realize. While Allied intelligence believed the Germans were years away from developing atomic weapons, recently discovered documents revealed that Nazi scientists were closer to success than anyone imagined. The German nuclear program began in 1939, just months after the discovery of nuclear fission. Unlike the massive Manhattan Project in the United States, the Nazi program was highly compartmentalized, with different research teams working on separate aspects of atomic weapons development, without knowing the full scope of the project. Nazi scientists had successfully created a functioning nuclear reactor by 1944, using heavy water obtained from their facility in occupied Norway. This reactor, hidden in a cave system near the town of Haigerloch, was producing plutonium that could be used in atomic weapons. The facility was so secret that even high-ranking Nazi officials were unaware of its existence. What made the Nazi nuclear program particularly dangerous was their willingness to cut corners on safety in ways that the Allied programs would never have attempted. They were developing what they called dirty bombs, nuclear weapons designed to spread radioactive material over wide areas, making entire regions uninhabitable for decades. The Nazis had also developed delivery systems for their nuclear weapons that were years ahead of anything the Allies possessed. The V-2 rocket program, led by Wernher von Braun, wasn't just aimed at terrorizing London. It was designed to carry nuclear warheads that could destroy entire cities. By 1945, Nazi engineers had successfully tested rockets capable of reaching targets over 200 miles away. They were working on intercontinental ballistic missiles that could strike targets in the United States from launch sites in occupied Europe. If they had succeeded in combining these rockets with nuclear warheads, the war could have had a very different outcome. But the nuclear program was just one part of a broader weapons development effort that included some of the most advanced military technology of the era. Nazi scientists were developing jet aircraft, guided missiles, and electronic warfare systems that wouldn't appear in Allied arsenals until years after the war ended. The Nazi jet program produced aircraft that were significantly faster and more maneuverable than anything the Allies could field. The Messerschmitt Me-262, which entered service in 1944, could outfly any Allied fighter aircraft and was armed with a. The Nazi jet program produced aircraft that were significantly faster and more maneuverable than anything the Allies could field. The Messerschmitt Me-262, which entered service in 1944, could outfly any Allied fighter aircraft and was armed with cannons powerful enough to destroy bombers with just a few hits. More advanced designs were in development, including swept-wing aircraft that anticipated post-war jet fighter designs by several years. The Horten Ho 229, a flying wing design, combined stealth characteristics with high-speed performance and could have revolutionized air warfare if it had entered production in significant numbers. Nazi engineers were also developing what they called America Bomber, long-range aircraft designed to strike targets in the United States from bases in Europe. These weren't just propaganda projects. They were serious military developments with the potential to bring the war directly to American soil. The submarine program was equally advanced. Nazi engineers had developed submarines capable of remaining submerged for weeks at a time, using revolutionary air-independent propulsion systems. These boats could travel underwater at speeds that made them nearly impossible to detect and destroy with existing Allied technology. The Type 21 submarine, which entered service in the final months of the war, represented a quantum leap in underwater warfare technology. It could travel submerged at speeds faster than most Allied surface vessels, and was equipped with sophisticated sonar systems that gave it a significant advantage in underwater combat. Even more advanced designs were in development, including submarines capable of launching ballistic missiles while submerged. These boats would have been able to strike coastal targets in Britain and the United States without surfacing, making them virtually undetectable until it was too late. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the Nazi weapons program was their development of chemical and biological weapons designed for mass destruction. They had weaponized nerve agents like taboon and sarin years before the Allies were even aware such substances existed. Nazi chemical weapons facilities were producing thousands of tons of nerve agents by 1944. These weapons were so deadly that exposure to even microscopic amounts could kill within minutes. The Nazis had developed delivery systems that could disperse these agents over wide areas, potentially killing millions of people in a single attack. They were also working on what they called population weapons, biological agents designed to cause sterility or genetic damage in enemy populations. These weren't just weapons of war. They were tools of genocide that could eliminate entire ethnic groups without the need for concentration camps or mass executions. The Nazi weapons program also included research into electromagnetic warfare that was decades ahead of its time. They were developing radar systems that could detect aircraft at distances previously thought impossible, as well as electronic jamming equipment that could disrupt Allied communications and navigation systems. Nazi engineers had successfully tested what they called death rays, focused electromagnetic beams that could disable aircraft engines or detonate ammunition at a distance. While these weapons were not yet practical for battlefield use, they represented a technological capability that the Allies didn't even know was possible. In the final months of the war, as Allied forces overran German research facilities, they discovered weapons programs that defied belief. Nazi scientists had been working on anti-gravity devices, weather control systems, and energy weapons that seemed more like science fiction than military hardware. Many of these programs were evacuated to secret facilities in the final weeks of the war. Nazi officials established hidden research centers in remote locations where work could continue even after Germany's surrender. Some of these facilities were never discovered, and their secrets may have died with the scientists who worked there. The scope of the Nazi weapons program only became clear after the war, when Allied intelligence teams began piecing together information from captured documents and interrogated scientists. What they discovered was a technological capability that could have changed the course of human history if it had been fully developed and deployed. As the Third Reich crumbled in the spring of 1945, Nazi officials weren't just destroying evidence of their crimes, they were implementing carefully planned escape routes that would allow the most dangerous war criminals to disappear into new identities around the world. These weren't improvised escapes, they were sophisticated networks that had been years in the making. The rat lines, as they came to be known, were elaborate underground networks that stretched across Europe and extended into South America, the Middle East, and other regions where Nazi fugitives could find sanctuary. These networks were so well organized that they resembled intelligence operations more than refugee assistance programs. The Catholic Church played a controversial role in many of these escape routes. Certain members of the clergy, motivated by anti-communist sentiment and sometimes by sympathy for Nazi ideology, provided assistance to fleeing war criminals. They issued false identity documents, provided safe houses, and arranged transportation to countries that would offer protection. Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the German Church in Rome, became one of the most important figures in the rat line operations. He personally assisted dozens of high-ranking Nazi officials in obtaining new identities and passage to South America. Hudal believed that these men could be valuable assets in the fight against communism and deserved protection despite their wartime activities. The most sophisticated rat line operations were coordinated by Odessa, the organization of former SS members. This wasn't just a mutual aid society. It was a well-funded, professionally organized network that could provide complete identity changes, financial support, and safe passage to anywhere in the world. Odessa maintained safe houses across Europe, often in remote monasteries or private estates owned by Nazi sympathizers. These facilities could accommodate dozens of fugitives at a time and were equipped with document forging equipment, medical facilities, and communication systems that allowed coordination with other network cells. The organization had infiltrated immigration offices, police departments, and government agencies across Europe. They had contacts who could provide genuine identity documents, not just forgeries, allowing war criminals to assume completely legitimate new identities that would stand up to official scrutiny. Argentina became the primary destination for Nazi fugitives, thanks to the policies of President Juan Perón and his wife Eva. The Perón government actively recruited Nazi scientists, engineers, and military officers, offering them positions in the Argentine government and military in exchange for their expertise. Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust, lived openly in Argentina for over a decade under the name Ricardo Clement. He worked for Mercedes-Benz and raised a family, completely integrated into Argentine society until Israeli agents finally tracked him down in 1960. Josef Mengele, the notorious Auschwitz doctor, also found refuge in South America. He lived first in Argentina, then Paraguay, and finally Brazil, protected by a network of Nazi sympathizers who provided him with financial support and security. Despite international efforts to capture him, Mengele died in Brazil in 1979, having never faced justice for his crimes. But Argentina wasn't the only destination. Paraguay, under the dictatorship of Alfredo Stroessner, became a haven for Nazi war criminals. Stroessner himself was of German descent and was sympathetic to Nazi ideology. His government provided protection and new identities to hundreds of fugitive Nazis. The Middle East also became a destination for Nazi fugitives, particularly those with technical expertise that could be useful to Arab governments. Several Nazi rocket scientists found employment with the Egyptian government, helping to develop ballistic missile programs that could threaten Israel. Syria recruited former Nazi intelligence officers to help establish their secret police and internal security apparatus. These men brought with them the techniques of surveillance, interrogation, and population control that they had perfected under the Nazi regime.